The sweet Omega teased the giant white wolf for being chubby. The Alpha King secretly worked out every night. Fog still clung to Lake Hallstatt the morning. Leo Hartley marched into the village square, dragging a rope behind him and grinning like he'd already won the ribbon. What he'd found wasn't a lost sheepdog. It was a wolf the size of a cart horse, silver-eyed and utterly unbothered, letting a stranger loop a rope around his neck without so much as a growl. Within days, that same wolf was sneaking back to a hidden training yard every night, hauling sandbags until dawn, all because one village boy had patted his side and called him Chubby. A king with a secret, a boy who had no idea what he'd stumbled into. What was he really hiding, and why did one careless word change everything? Stay with us to find out. Pull up a chair and let us walk you through the story of Leo Hartley, the Omega who mistook a king for a lost sheepdog and marched him straight through the village square. If you've ever confidently done something wrong in front of an entire crowd of people, tell us about it in the comments below. If anyone in Hallstatt ever tells you the story of how their Alpha King fell in love, they will insist it began with a lost dog. They are technically correct. They are also leaving out the part where the dog in question weighed roughly as much as a fully grown man and had teeth the size of dinner spoons. The morning fog had not yet lifted off Lake Hallstatt when Leo Hartley slipped out of his aunt's apothecary with a rope looped over one shoulder and a heart full of misplaced confidence. Farmer Otto Bauer's sheepdog, Bruno, had gone missing 2 days before the midsummer fair, and the whole village had turned the search into something between a rescue mission and a scavenger hunt. Whoever found Bruno first would win a blue ribbon and, more importantly, would never hear the end of it from Frau Lindner at the bakery, who had already started composing a song about it. Leo wanted that ribbon. Not for himself, he told himself this very firmly, but because Otto Bauer's daughter had cried at the market, and Leo could not stand to watch anyone cry when there was something he could do about it. The lake itself lay perfectly still that morning, pewter gray and silent, the kind of stillness that made every bird call sound too loud and every footstep too obvious. Leo's boots crunched over frost-stiffened grass as he climbed the narrow trail above the village, past the salt merchants' carts, already creaking toward the market square, past old Frau Roth's goats bleating for their breakfast, until the sounds of Hallstatt fell away entirely, and only the forest remained, pine resin heavy in the cold air, the distant chatter of a woodpecker, somewhere the wet mineral smell of the mountain stream that fed the lake below. The mist along the tree line thinned as the sun climbed, and that was when he saw it, a pale shape curled beneath a fir tree at the edge of the forest path, big and white and absolutely, unmistakably a dog, Bruno. Leo's voice cracked with joy. He dropped to his knees a respectful distance away, because even an excited Omega had some sense of caution. Oh, thank goodness! Everyone's been so worried. The shape lifted its head. 2 silver-gray eyes opened and regarded him with an expression that, on a human face, would have been called deep and personal offense. Leo did not notice. He was already looping the rope into a gentle collar shape, already imagining Otto Bauer's daughter's face, when he walked Bruno into the village square. Come on, boy, let's get you home. You must be starving. You're looking a little thin around the... He paused, actually looking at the animal for the first time, and revised his assessment on the spot. Actually, no, you look enormous. Did someone feed you an entire farm? The wolf stared at him. Leo took this as agreement and gently coaxed the rope around the animal's neck, chattering the whole time about how worried the village had been and how good a boy he was for waiting so patiently. And if some giant, dignified, deeply unamused wolf found himself unable to argue with any of it, well, that was hardly Leo's fault. He was simply too pleased with himself to notice. Correct him. By the time they reached the edge of the village square, half of Hallstatt had turned to look, and Leo was beaming with the particular pride of someone who has never once considered that things might go badly. They went badly. Leo Hartley. Frau Lindner's flour-dusted hands flew to her mouth. That is not Bruno. What do you mean, that's not? Leo turned to look properly at the animal beside him for the first time since the forest, really taking in, the sheer, towering, impossible size of it, the way its shoulder came up past his own ribs, the way its paws alone were larger than dinner plates. A very long, very quiet moment passed. That, Leo said slowly, is not Bruno. The wolf gave him a look that could only be described as finally. What followed was 3 minutes of the kind of chaos that Hallstatt would discuss for years. children screaming with a mixture of terror and delight, a chicken cart overturning for reasons nobody could later explain, Otto Bauer fainting dramatically onto a hay bale, and Leo standing in the middle of it all with a rope, still looped loosely in one hand, red to the tips of his ears, trying to explain that he had simply made a small mistake regarding a very large animal. A small mistake? Frau Lindner's voice climbed an octave that startled even the wolf. Leo Hartley, that is not a small mistake. That is a wolf the size of a cart horse. In fairness, Leo said weakly, he was very quiet about it. Somewhere behind him, a market stall's awning collapsed under the weight of a fleeing goose, and 3 separate children had already begun composing the version of the story they intended to tell their grandchildren. One involving fire, though no fire had been present at any point. The wolf, for his part, could have fled at any point. He was the fastest thing in the northern forests, faster than arrows, faster than the wind off the mountains. He stood exactly where he was, and let the panicking village sort itself out around him. Because the boy holding his rope had gone the color of a ripe tomato, and looked 1 heartbeat away from crying from sheer embarrassment, and something about that made leaving unthinkable. It was Leo who finally broke the standoff. He stepped between the wolf and the nearest pitchfork-wielding farmhand, arms spread wide. Wait, everyone, stop. Look at him. Does he look like he's about to eat anyone? Leo's voice shook slightly, but he did not move. He's been sitting here for 5 whole minutes and hasn't so much as growled. I think. He glanced back, and something in the wolf's calm, patient silver eyes seemed to steady him. I think he's just lost. Like the rest of us, apparently. Nobody argued with an omega putting himself between a village and a wolf twice his weight, mostly because nobody could quite believe it was happening. In the confusion, Leo took the opportunity to walk the enormous creature calmly back toward the tree line, murmuring apologies the whole way to the wolf, to the village, to whatever deity oversaw catastrophically embarrassing mornings. I am so sorry, he whispered once they'd reached the shelter of the pines, releasing the rope with trembling hands. I really thought you were a sheepdog. In my defense, it was very foggy, and you were very still, and I wanted that ribbon rather badly. Behind him, faintly, he could still hear the village square slowly reassembling itself. Someone riding the overturned chicken cart, Otto Bauer being fanned back to consciousness with a wide-brimmed hat, and Frau Lindner's voice carrying clear across the square, already composing the opening line of what would surely become the most popular song in Hallstatt by winter. The wolf sat. Leo stared at him. You're not going to eat me, are you? The wolf's tail thumped once against the pine needles, entirely against his own royal will. Leo's face broke into the kind of smile that made grown men forget their own names, let alone a startled king who had not smiled properly in longer than he could remember. Oh, was that a wag? Did you just... He clapped both hands over his mouth, delighted. You're not scary at all, are you? You just look terrifying. If wolves could sigh with the specific exhaustion of a king whose secret was slowly slipping through his own fingers, William did. Well, Leo said, settling cross-legged onto the pine needles, with the easy confidence of someone who had clearly never once considered his own mortality, since I already humiliated us both in front of the entire village, the least I can do is make sure you get a proper breakfast before you go wherever it is, enormous, mysterious wolves. He rummaged in the small satchel he always carried for herb gathering and produced half a loaf of dark rye bread, offering it out on both palms exactly as one would to a nervous horse. It's not much. I wasn't exactly prepared for this when I left the house this morning. Against every ounce of dignity 30 years of ruling had built in him, William leaned forward and accepted the bread with careful, deliberate gentleness, lips barely grazing Leo's fingers. Leo's breath caught, soft and quick, at the strange warm shiver that raced up his arm at the contact. Gone before he could name it, replaced almost instantly by delighted laughter. You have lovely manners for something the size of a barn door. That evening, his aunt listened to the entire story over supper with the particular calm of a woman who had raised Leo since he was small, and had therefore long since given up being surprised by anything he did. So, she said, ladling stew into his bowl, you mistook the duchy's largest predator for a farm dog, walked him through the village square in front of everyone, and are now planning to return tomorrow to check on his paw. When you say it like that, it sounds worse than it was. It sounds exactly as it was. She set the ladle down and studied him with the fond, exasperated look she reserved for precisely these occasions. You've always had more heart than sense, Leo. Ever since you were small, bringing home every wounded bird and stray cat in Hallstatt. He's not wounded. Well, he was a little. He's fine now. She said nothing further, though the small, knowing smile that crossed her face as she returned to the stove suggested she suspected, long before Leo did, exactly where this was headed. He would return to that forest the next morning. And the one after that. He told himself every single time that it was only because he felt guilty for the mix-up that any decent person would check on a lost, possibly injured wild animal. He was aware, somewhere beneath the excuses, that this was not entirely true. He simply wasn't ready to examine why yet. The second morning, Leo found the wolf exactly where he'd left him, as though the great white creature had never moved at all, though the flattened grass nearby told a different story, one that suggested considerable pacing. "Good morning," Leo called, swinging his basket down onto a flat stone. "I brought cheese today, and I want to look at your paw. You were favoring it yesterday, right at the end, and I've been thinking about it all night." William stiffened. He had, in fact, torn a thorn deep into the pad of his front paw 2 days prior while sprinting from the palace, and had been quietly, stoically ignoring it with the same discipline he applied to war councils and winter famines. It had not occurred to him that anyone would notice, let alone an Omega who had known him for exactly 1 full day. "Sit," Leo said, with the gentle firmness of someone used to coaxing frightened creatures, and, more specifically, someone who had spent a childhood pulling splinters from crying farm children. "I promise this will hurt less than whatever's currently happening in there." William sat. He told himself later it was only sensible. An infected wound would slow him down. He did not examine, even privately, why his heart had begun to beat strangely fast the moment Leo knelt and lifted his enormous paw into 2 small, careful hands. The thorn came free with 1 clean, practiced pull. William did not so much as flinch, though something in his chest did something far more dangerous than flinching. Leo worked slowly, humming under his breath the same wordless tune he'd hummed the first morning they met, his thumb tracing careful circles just above the wound to keep the great paw still. Up close, William's fur smelled of pine sap and cold mountain air, and beneath his palm Leo could feel the steady, enormous thud of a heartbeat that seemed entirely too fast for something so calm on the outside. "There," Leo breathed, pressing a cool, damp cloth against the wound, his fingers gentle against fur and pad alike. "You didn't even make a sound. Are all wolves this brave, or is it just you?" He looked up as he said it, and for one long, suspended moment their eyes met. Leo's warm brown ones, wide with quiet concern, and William's pale silver ones, caught utterly, hopelessly off guard, and something passed between them that neither had words for yet. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere above, a raven shifted on its branch and said nothing, for once. Leo looked away first, cheeks warming for reasons that had nothing to do with the summer sun, and busied himself wrapping a strip of clean linen around the paw with exaggerated focus. There, all better. He sat back on his heels to admire his work, and it was in doing so, surveying the great white wolf now stretched comfortably before him, paw bandaged, belly slightly rounded from what Leo could only assume was a very healthy appetite for whatever wolves hunted. That inspiration struck. He tilted his head. He studied the wolf's broad chest, his soft-looking sides, the small, comfortable roundness just above his hips. "You know," Leo said, with the air of a man arriving at a great scientific discovery, "you're magnificent, truly, biggest, whitest, most impressive wolf I've ever seen, which, granted, is a list of one, but still." He reached out, and very gently patted William's side, the way one might a favorite armchair. "But you're also," he pressed his lips together, fighting a smile, "a little bit chubby." Time itself seemed to catch on something. A dragonfly hovered motionless over the stream. Somewhere in the branches above, the raven made a sound that could only be described as a cackle. William, Alpha King of Corinthia, undefeated in single combat for 11 years, terror of 3 rival packs, the man whose name alone had ended 2 wars before the first arrow was loosed, stared at the small, cheerful Omega currently patting his side like a prize cow, and found, for possibly the first time in his adult life, that he had absolutely no idea what to do with himself. "There it is," Leo said, delighted, as if he hadn't just upended the natural order of the entire northern kingdom. "Don't be embarrassed. It's endearing. I'm calling you Chubby." William's tail, the traitor, thumped twice against the grass. Leo's eyes went round with delight. Oh, you like it. He did not, in fact, like it. He absolutely did not like it. He spent the entire walk back to the castle attempting to convince himself of this fact, and arrived at Hohenwerfen's gates having failed so completely that even the guards on watch exchanged a concerned glance at whatever expression their king was currently wearing. He returned to Eckern Valley again the following afternoon, telling himself it was purely to check that the thorn wound was healing properly. Leo was waiting with a wooden brush this time, and the great white wolf took one long, suspicious look at it before retreating 3 full steps. "Oh, don't be dramatic," Leo said, entirely unmoved. "It's only a brush." Another cautious step backward. "You're nearly 8 feet long from nose to tail, and a little brush frightens you." Leo planted both hands on his hips, surveying him with the exact expression he realized that Frau Lindner used on unruly bread dough. "Come here." William did not move. "Please." He still refused, though his tail had already begun to betray him, sweeping small, guilty arcs through the grass. "I baked for you," Leo said, holding up a small parcel of shortbread with the solemnity of a bargaining chip. William walked forward with the resigned dignity of a warrior accepting an impossible mission, and settled onto the grass beside him. Leo worked the brush through the thick fur along his shoulders with slow, careful strokes, laughing softly under his breath. "You shed enough to knit 3 sweaters, you know that? You must roast alive come summer." He paused, studying the coat beneath his hands. "No wonder you're a little fluffy." William opened one eye. "Very fluffy," Leo added, grinning. William looked pointedly toward the trees. "The fluffiest wolf in this entire valley." Leo finished, delighted, and William's tail thumped once against the ground despite every ounce of effort he put into stopping it. Leo pointed triumphantly. "Caught you." William lowered his head in surrender, and Leo laughed until his eyes watered, reaching over afterward to straighten one stubborn tuft of fur near his neck. "There," he said with quiet satisfaction. "Handsome." William's heart did something remarkably inconvenient at that, and he looked away so quickly toward a passing butterfly that Leo noticed immediately, covering his mouth to hide a delighted grin. "Oh my goodness, are you blushing?" Wolves did not blush. Alpha King certainly did not blush. William found himself once again with absolutely no evidence to the contrary. Steward Charles Whitmore had served 3 generations of Sternhart kings, and in all that time he had never once seen William distracted during a council session. He had seen him govern through famine, through a border skirmish that nearly cost the duchy its northern pass, through the death of his own father, always composed, always exact, always 3 steps ahead of every argument raised against him. That Tuesday, William asked Lord Hessler, mid-report on grain tariffs, whether apples paired well with cinnamon. The chamber went silent. "Your Majesty," Lord Hessler ventured. "Continue," William said, with the flat dignity of a man pretending nothing unusual had occurred. By the 3rd such incident that week, this one involving the phrase, "Does anyone know if wolves are allowed to enjoy honeycomb?" Hypothetically, Charles requested a private word. "You've been somewhere else all week," Charles said, once the council chamber had emptied. It wasn't a question. William said nothing, which for a man renowned for his composure was itself a confession. "Is it a person?" Another silence, longer this time. Charles allowed himself the smallest, most carefully managed smile of his career. "I see." "And does this person know they've been having tea with the King of Carinthia while addressing him as a household pet?" "He addresses me as Chubby," William said, with the particular gravity of a man revealing a state secret. Charles had served this family for 15 years. He had negotiated hostage exchanges without blinking. He now had to excuse himself from the room for a solid 2 minutes before he could compose his face enough to return. "For what it's worth," he said once he'd recovered, "I don't believe he meant it as an insult. Perhaps he simply feels comfortable enough to tease you." Charles picked up the report he'd abandoned. "For the record, you are not Chubby." "I am aware," William said stiffly. "Although," Charles added halfway to the door, unable to resist, "if you begin requesting cinnamon pastries with every meal, we may need to revisit that conversation." The door closed behind him. William stood alone in the empty council chamber for a long moment. Then, almost without meaning to, he smiled. A few evenings later, Charles arrived to deliver the day's correspondence and found William standing before the tall mirror in his private chambers, turning slowly sideways, then the other way, studying his own reflection with the same grim focus he usually reserved for battle maps. "Your Majesty," Charles said carefully. "Are you?" "No," William said. I hadn't finished the question. The answer remains no. Charles set the correspondence down with exaggerated care, fighting to keep his tone neutral. "Then may I ask why Your Majesty has requested a full conditioning regimen from the royal trainer effective tomorrow at dawn?" William did not answer. He did not need to. Charles simply bowed, hiding his smile once more, and made a private note to inform the trainer that this particular assignment might be the most entertaining of his career. The royal training yard had never, in living memory, hosted a king before sunrise voluntarily. It hosted one the very next morning. "Your Majesty," the elderly trainer said carefully, watching William complete a set of push-ups with the joyless focus of a man conducting a military campaign. "May I ask the objective?" "Personal improvement," William said, without looking up. Charles, leaning against a pillar with his arms crossed and clearly enjoying this far more than protocol allowed, added helpfully, "He was recently informed he is chubby." "I was not," William said, rising smoothly. "Informed, I was observed. By someone who also called you handsome, fluffy, and sweet in the same breath, if I recall your account correctly." William picked up a training sword with unnecessary force and said nothing further on the matter, which the trainer correctly interpreted as confirmation. Over the following days, the training yard became William's second throne room. He mastered the balance beam on his first attempt and demanded to repeat it regardless. He hauled sandbags until the trainer ran out of larger ones to offer. He performed core exercises with a discipline previously reserved for treaty negotiations, all while doing his level best to appear as though this had always been his habit and had nothing whatsoever to do with a certain village boy's wandering hands and unfiltered opinions. "You know," Charles observed one morning, watching William attempt his fourth consecutive set without so much as a pause for breath, "no amount of training erases a nickname given with fondness." William paused, sword lowered. "Fondness. He smiles every time he says it. That is not mockery." "Your Majesty." "That is affection with terrible manners." Charles allowed himself another small, careful smile. "Not that my opinion carries much weight here, but I don't believe he'd love you any less soft around the middle. I also understand that isn't really the point. Is it?" The trainer, an elderly wolf named Hoffman, who had drilled 3 generations of royal guardsmen, eventually rolled out a heavy wooden sled and gestured for William to take the handles. "Most recruits begin with half this weight, Your Majesty." William took hold without comment and pushed. The sled glided across the packed earth with such force that Hoffman stumbled backward in surprise, nearly losing his footing. "Again," William said. "Again?" Hoffman glanced, faintly desperate, toward Charles, who only shrugged with the expression of a man who had long since stopped trying to explain his king's recent behavior to anyone. "Improvement comes through repetition," William said, and hauled the sled a second time, harder than strictly necessary, while somewhere in his mind, Leo laughed and brushed his fur and called him, with maddening affection, very fluffy. By the time the session ended, William was breathing hard for the first time in years, sweat soaking through his training shirt, and Charles, watching from his usual pillar, allowed himself, at last, a genuine, unguarded smile rather than his usual carefully managed one. "I have known you 15 years, Your Majesty," he said. "I have watched you negotiate impossible treaties without so much as raising your voice, and yet somehow this remains the strangest week of my career." William said nothing, because Charles was, infuriatingly, correct, and there was very little dignity in admitting that a stranger's teasing had somehow become the most important opinion in his entire kingdom. The Hallstatt Midsummer Fair arrived exactly as scheduled, ribbon and all, and Leo attended out of both civic duty and the small sheepish hope that showing his face might finally put the great wolf incident to rest. It did not. "There he is," called Farmer Bauer good-naturedly from behind a table of pickled cabbage, the man who tried to enter a wolf in the best-behaved beast contest. "I did not try to enter him," Leo said, for what felt like the 40th time that week. "I thought he was Bruno. Bruno, might I remind everyone, was found napping in your own hayloft the very next morning." "Still," Bauer said, grinning, "would have been a shame not to see how the judges scored him. Terrible manners, I'd imagine, being a wolf and all. Leo opened his mouth to defend a set of table manners he had, in fact, personally verified to be impeccable, caught himself and shut it again with a suspicious cough. He wandered the fair for the better part of the afternoon, admiring Frau Lindner's prize-winning honey cake, losing spectacularly at the ring-toss stall, allowing a small child to braid wildflowers into his hair with grave ceremonial seriousness, and it was only as dusk settled and lanterns were lit along the square that he noticed the pale shape watching from the tree line at the edge of the fairgrounds. Well beyond the last stalls, patient and still as a carved thing, Leo's heart did something warm and complicated. He excused himself from the dance circle forming near the bandstand and slipped away with a plate of honey cake tucked against his chest. "You came," he said softly, once he'd reached the shadow of the pines. "Even knowing half the village still teases me for you." William dipped head toward the plate with unmistakable interest, and Leo laughed, breaking off a piece and offering it exactly as he had that very first morning. "For the record," Leo added, glancing back toward the glow and music of the fair, "you'd have won Best Behaved Beast without the slightest contest." Every other entrant this year bid a judge. William's tail swept once through the grass, deeply, quietly pleased, and for a long while they simply sat together at the fair's edge, close enough to hear the fiddle music, far enough to remain a secret, while lanterns bobbed like fallen stars across the square, and neither of them wanted to be anywhere else at all. When the last lantern finally guttered out, and the fiddler packed away his instrument for the night, Leo rose reluctantly, brushing crumbs from his sleeves. "I should go before someone notices I've vanished." He hesitated, then pressed one hand briefly against William's broad shoulder. "Same time tomorrow, Chubby?" The answering wag needed no translation at all. Word travels quickly in a village the size of Hallstatt, and within a fortnight, everyone knew that Leo Hartley had made a habit of walking into the northern forest each afternoon and returning each evening humming to himself with a suspiciously empty basket. Frau Lindner cornered him at the bakery counter one morning, flour-dusted hands on her hips. "You're still visiting that wolf." "Almost every day," Leo admitted, unbothered. "People worry because they care about you, dear. There are old stories about those woods." Leo smiled, gentle but unmoved. Stories aren't always the same as truth. He tucked the honey biscuits carefully into his basket, already planning which ones he would save for himself and which would inevitably vanish the moment a certain white wolf caught their scent. Frau Lindner sighed the particular sigh of someone who had known Leo since he was small enough to be carried on one hip, and reached beneath the counter for a paper-wrapped parcel she had, quite clearly, prepared in advance. "Well, if you insist on feeding a wild animal instead of listening to your elders, you may as well feed him properly." She pressed the parcel into his hands before he could argue. "Cinnamon, don't tell your aunt I gave these away for free." Leo laughed, delighted despite himself, and pressed a kiss to her flour-dusted cheek before she could pretend to be annoyed about it. He spent that morning at the village market, weaving between stalls heavy with late summer plums and fresh trout from the lake, exchanging easy greetings with neighbors who had by now mostly forgiven him for the great wolf incident, if only because it had given the whole village something to laugh about for weeks. He haggled cheerfully over the price of a jar of mountain honey. "I know you raised the price the moment you noticed I keep buying it 3 times a week, Herr Adler, and I resent it deeply," before finally making his way to the bakery, where, paper parcel of honey biscuits tucked under one arm, he collided, quite literally, with Edmund Faust. Edmund was, by every objective village measure, extremely handsome, broad-shouldered, quick to laugh, the best hunter in 3 valleys, and entirely too aware of all 3 facts. He caught Leo's elbow to steady him and did not let go quite as quickly as strictly necessary. "Careful there," Edmund said, flashing the smile that had, according to local legend, once caused a milkmaid to walk directly into a fence post. "Where's a man off to in such a hurry? Some secret sweetheart waiting in the woods?" Leo laughed and extracted his arm with practiced ease. "Something like that." He meant it as a joke. He did not expect the words to travel, but travel they did, all the way to a certain white wolf lying in wait at the edge of Eckern Valley that very afternoon, who overheard Edmund Faust recounting the exchange to a group of amused farmhands with considerable embellishment. William did not, technically, do anything that could be called jealous. He simply happened to be standing directly between Leo and Edmund. When the hunter next attempted to walk Leo home from the market, teeth bared just enough to suggest that the shortest path home might, perhaps, run somewhere else entirely. Chubby! Leo's scandalized laughter rang out across the square. That is incredibly rude. Apologize to Edmund at once. William did not apologize to Edmund. William sat pointedly, directly on Edmund's foot until the hunter, wincing, decided he had urgent business elsewhere. You, Leo informed him later, walking arm in arm, or rather, arm around shoulder-height fur, toward the valley, are the single most dramatic wolf I have ever met. William's tail swept back and forth in a rhythm that suggested he considered this a great compliment. I mean it, Leo continued, though the smile tugging at his mouth rather undercut the scolding. Poor Edmund's only ever been friendly. He can't help it if he's a bit. He searched for the word golden retriever about everything. Not 2 days later, Edmund made the mistake of appearing at the edge of Eckern Valley itself, having followed a deer trail that happened to intersect with Leo's afternoon walk, and greeted him with the easy, confident smile that had never once failed him with anyone else in Hallstatt. Fancy meeting you all the way out here, Edmund said, falling into step beside him. Alone in the woods. Rather bold of you. I'm not alone, Leo said cheerfully, and as if summoned by the words themselves, a great white shape emerged silently from the tree line and positioned itself, with unmistakable deliberateness, directly between the two of them. Edmund took an involuntary step back. That's the wolf. The one from the fair. That's Chubby, Leo said, delighted, patting William's side as though introducing an old friend at a dinner party. He's very protective. I'd apologize, but honestly, I find it a little charming. William, for his part, sat down precisely on the toe of Edmund's boot and remained there with the immovable patience of a mountain, silver eyes fixed on the hunter with an expression that required no translation whatsoever. Right, Edmund said, extracting his foot with as much dignity as he could manage. I've just remembered I have somewhere else to be. Leo watched him go, laughing so hard he had to lean against William's shoulder to stay upright. You are shameless, he said. Utterly shameless. What must the poor man think of you? William, who still did not know what a golden retriever was, but had by this point gathered it was not flattering, made a low sound in his throat that might charitably have been called a growl and might less charitably have been called a sulk. Leo stopped walking. He turned, studied William with the same exaggerated scientific seriousness he'd once used to declare him chubby, and said, very softly, Were you jealous? Silence. Chubby, were you jealous? William looked, with tremendous dignity, at a nearby cloud. Leo's laugh was warm enough to chase the last of the afternoon chill from the air. He stepped closer and pressed his palm flat against William's broad chest, right over the place where his heart, quite inconveniently, had begun to beat far too fast. You have absolutely nothing to worry about, Leo said, quieter now, all the teasing gone soft at the edges. There's no one in this whole valley I'd rather spend my afternoons with than you. William closed his eyes, and for one unguarded moment allowed himself simply to lean into that hand, into that warmth, into the terrifying, wonderful certainty that he had fallen in love with someone who thought he was a household pet. The rumor reached Hallstatt on a Thursday and consumed the village by Saturday. The Alpha King of Carinthia was entertaining a formal visit from Lord Frederick of Salzburg, a young, well-connected Omega whose family had been angling for a political match for over a year. By Sunday, the market square had transformed the news into an entire festival of speculation. Someone claimed Lord Frederick traveled with his own personal orchestra. Someone else insisted he'd brought 3 carriages of wedding silk already, just in case. The blacksmith's wife swore she'd heard the wedding was already set for the first frost, though nobody could say where such a precise detail had come from, least of all her. Leo heard it first from Frau Lindner, who delivered the news with the breathless gravity usually reserved for weather disasters. They say he's terribly elegant. Silk from Venice, apparently. The whole council is delighted. That's nice, Leo said, and was surprised by how much effort the word required. He told himself, walking to the valley that afternoon, that it was none of his business who the king courted. He was a herbalist's apprentice who talked to a wolf in the woods. The affairs of Hohenwerfen Castle belonged to an entirely different world, one that had never once intersected with his own small, quiet life. And yet he found himself, that evening, sitting beside William, with his knees drawn to his chest, uncharacteristically quiet. "Sorry," he said eventually, when the silence had stretched long enough for even William to notice something was wrong. "I've just got something silly on my mind. There's talk in the village that the king might be getting married soon, to some noble from Salzburg." He picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. "I don't even know why it bothers me. I've never met the man. I don't suppose it's any of my business who a king loves." William went very, very still. "It's just," Leo continued, quieter now, "I've gotten used to having somewhere warm to come to every day. Someone to talk to who actually listens." He glanced sideways, managed a small, rueful smile. "I suppose I'm being ridiculous, comparing my afternoons with a wolf to whatever grand romance is happening up at that castle." If William could have spoken in that moment, he would have told him, simply and completely, that there was no grand romance happening at that castle at all. That Lord Frederick's visit was a council maneuver he had already privately decided to refuse. That every single one of those grand afternoons Leo dismissed so lightly had in fact become the truest thing in his entire life. He could not speak. He could only press his head gently against Leo's shoulder and stay there until the tightness eased from the smaller man's frame. 2 days later, William did not come to the valley at all, nor the day after that. By the 4th day, Leo sat alone beneath the old oak tree with a basket he hadn't the heart to finish unpacking, watching the tree line for a shape that never emerged, and understood, with the particular quiet ache of someone realizing a thing has ended without ever being told why, exactly how much he had come to depend on those afternoons. He tried, in the days that followed, to fill the empty hours the way he always had before, sorting dried lavender at the apothecary counter, walking the market stalls with his aunt, laughing at Edmund Faust's increasingly elaborate attempts at flirtation, which had grown bolder now that his usual four-legged rival seemed to have vanished entirely. None of it filled the particular quiet that settled over him each evening when the light turned gold over the lake, and there was no warm, familiar shape waiting beneath the oak tree to greet it with him. "You've gone soft in the head over an animal," his aunt teased gently one night, setting a bowl of soup in front of him. "It happens to the best of us. My own mother once mourned a goat for a full season. It's not—" Leo pushed the soup around with his spoon, unable to finish the sentence, because he did not, in fact, know how to explain that it did not feel like mourning an animal at all. It felt like missing a person. It felt, if he let himself think about it too honestly, like heartbreak, which made no sense whatsoever, and which he therefore refused, for the rest of that week, to examine too closely. It was the raven who finally took pity on him. On the 5th morning, as Leo trudged toward the valley with dwindling hope, the great black bird swooped low over his head, circled once, and flew a short distance toward the mountain road before landing on a fence post and staring at him expectantly. "What?" Leo asked, and the bird gave an impatient caw and flew a little further, waiting each time for him to catch up. He followed it for the better part of an hour, up the winding road that climbed toward the pale stone walls of Hohenwerfen Castle, until he stood at the base of the hill staring up at towers he'd only ever seen from a distance. Wondering, foolishly he told himself, so foolishly, whether he was about to make an even bigger fool of himself than the day he'd dragged a wolf through the village square. The climb took longer than he expected, the road growing steeper and the air thinner as Hallstatt shrank to a scattering of rooftops far below, and with every step Leo's stomach tightened further, half with worry for whatever had kept his wolf away so long, half with a growing, unnamed dread that he could not quite explain and did not want to examine too closely. By the time the castle's pale walls rose before him, catching the late morning sun like something out of one of his aunt's old fairy tales, his hands had gone cold despite the warmth of the day. He found a gap in the eastern hedge where the guard's rounds left a gap, slipped through with the ease of someone who had spent a childhood sneaking through farmers' orchards, and made his way toward the sound of raised voices drifting from an open garden window. "Cannot simply refuse the match, Your Majesty. The council has already. I have made my decision, Lord Hessler. I will not marry a man I have never spoken to for the sake of a border agreement I could secure through trade negotiations within the season." Leo froze at the second voice. It was deep, calm, achingly familiar in a way that made no sense at all, and yet he crept closer, heart hammering, and looked through the garden gate just as the tall man speaking turned in profile. Pale hair, broad shoulders, the same unhurried, patient stillness Leo had come to know so well over the past weeks, wearing it now not as fur but as skin. The basket slipped from Leo's fingers and struck the gravel path with a soft, damning thud. Every head in the garden turned. William's eyes found his across the courtyard, and for one terrible, endless moment, neither of them moved. "Chubby?" Leo whispered, and it came out somewhere between a laugh and a sob, disbelief and hurt tangled together so tightly he could not tell where one ended and the other began. You're the king?" Lord Hessler and two other council members stared between the king and the flower-dusted young man now frozen in the garden gate, visibly attempting to reconstruct how their monarch could possibly be acquainted with an apothecary's apprentice from Hallstatt, and arriving, with dawning horror, at several conclusions at once. Leo. William was already crossing the garden toward him, every ounce of royal composure abandoned. "Let me explain." "You let me." Leo took a step back, pressing a hand to his own mouth as though he could physically stop the words tumbling out of it. "I called you Chubby. To your face. I brushed you. I told the whole village I'd found a lost dog, and then I fed a state-secret cinnamon rolls for a month. You made every single one of those days the best of my entire life," William said, quiet and utterly sincere, closing the distance between them until he stood close enough that Leo had to tip his head back to meet his eyes. The same silver eyes, he realized now, that had never once changed, whether wolf or man. "I should have told you sooner. I was afraid that the moment you knew who I truly was, you would stop looking at me the way you did in that valley. Like I was simply someone worth knowing, crown or no crown." Leo's eyes were bright with unshed tears, anger and relief, and something far softer all warring for space on his face. "And Lord Frederick? The whole village thinks you're about to be married." "I have already refused him," William said, and reached out, slowly, giving Leo every chance to step away, which he did not, to gently brush a strand of hair from his forehead. "There has only ever been one person I wanted to marry, and he spent the last month calling me Fluffy and feeding me pastries in a forest clearing." Leo let out a wet, startled laugh, dragging the back of his wrist across his eyes. "You disappeared for 5 days. I sat under that tree every afternoon thinking you'd simply grown tired of me. Do you have any idea?" "I know." William's voice cracked on the words, all royal steadiness gone. "I should have found some way to warn you. I thought of nothing else the entire week, Leo. Not the treaty, not the council, not Lord Frederick's endless talk of Venetian silk. Only you, sitting alone in that valley, wondering why I'd stopped coming." He reached for Leo's hand, and this time did not hesitate. "I am sorry, truly. I never once meant for you to feel forgotten. You were the least forgettable thing that has ever happened to me." The council chamber had witnessed treaty negotiations, coronations, and one memorable incident involving a diplomatic gift of live peacocks. It had never witnessed its king stride in unannounced, a village apothecary's apprentice at his side, and declare, before Lord Hessler could so much as clear his throat, that the matter of his marriage was, as of that morning, entirely settled. "Your Majesty," Lord Hessler began, "the alliance with Salzburg will be secured through the trade agreement I proposed last spring, which several of you dismissed as impractical," William said evenly. "I have made my choice regarding marriage, and it does not require your approval, though I would prefer your blessing." Leo, standing slightly behind him and doing his very best impression of someone who was not currently having the single strangest week of his life, felt every eye in the chamber turn toward him. "This," William said, and something in his voice, steady, warm, entirely unguarded, made Leo's chest ache in the best possible way, "is Leo Hartley. He found me lost and exhausted in the forest, and fed me before he knew my name, let alone my crown. He has scolded me for poor manners, nursed a thorn from my paw, defended me from an entire village armed with pitchforks, and called me Chubby to my face on our very first meeting." A ripple of stunned laughter passed through the chamber. "He did not love a king," William continued. "He loved a tired, lonely creature who wandered into his forest looking for one peaceful morning, and he made that morning kinder than any I have known in this castle. I intend to marry him, with or without the council's blessing, though I would very much prefer the latter." For a long moment, no one in the chamber spoke at all. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, a bell tolled the hour, ordinary and unhurried, as though the whole world hadn't just quietly rearranged itself around one very startled apothecary's apprentice. Charles Whitmore, standing near the back of the chamber, allowed himself a smile he did not bother to hide this time. "If it helps, your majesty," he said, "I believe the council will find itself remarkably persuadable." "With respect, your majesty," another council member ventured, clearly still attempting to reconcile the dignified ruler she had served for a decade with the man currently gazing at a village apothecary's apprentice as though he'd personally hung the moon. "How long precisely has this arrangement been ongoing?" "A little over a month," William said, "and in this time he addressed you as Chubby," Leo supplied helpfully, entirely unbothered by the room full of nobility now staring at him. "Also, occasionally, your fluffiness, though that one never quite caught on." A ripple of poorly suppressed laughter moved through the chamber a second time. Even Lord Hessler's stern mouth twitched dangerously. "I would remind the council," William added, with the particular dry calm he usually reserved for negotiating trade disputes, "that this same apothecary's apprentice pulled a thorn from my paw with his bare hands, defended me from an armed farming village with nothing but his own 2 arms, and never once asked what I could offer him in return. I have received a great many gifts as king, none have meant more." Lord Hessler, outmaneuvered and outnumbered by his own colleagues' amused murmuring, sighed the sigh of a man who recognized a losing battle. "Well," he said at last, "I suppose it would be a shame to argue with someone who's already survived being called Chubby to his face, and lived to marry him anyway." That evening, once the council chamber had emptied, and the last of the astonished murmuring had faded down the corridors, William found Leo standing alone in the castle's east garden, staring up at the towers with an expression somewhere between wonder and disbelief. "I still can't quite believe it," Leo admitted, as William came to stand beside him. "A month ago I was scrubbing thorns out of your paw in a forest clearing. Now I'm apparently about to become— what, exactly? What do they even call the husband of an alpha king?" "Fortunate," William said, entirely straight-faced, and earned himself an elbow to the ribs. He showed Leo through the castle properly then, not as a king presenting his domain, but simply as William, pointing out the library where he'd spent long winters as a boy. The kitchens where the palace's famously stern head cook turned out to have a secret weakness for cinnamon that rivaled Leo's own, the narrow servant's stare he'd used 100 times to escape stuffy state dinners. Leo trailed his fingers along tapestries and marveled at chandeliers, and upon reaching the training yard, burst into such delighted laughter that 2 guards on night watch nearly dropped their spears. "This is where you've been sneaking off to every evening," Leo gasped, taking in the sandbags, the balance beam, the sled still bearing deep grooves from William's increasingly aggressive training sessions. "Chubby, you built an entire training regimen because I patted your side and called you soft. I prefer to think of it as personal improvement," William said, with as much dignity as a man could summon while being laughed at in his own castle. "You are the single most ridiculous king this duchy has ever had," Leo said, still grinning, and stepped close enough to rest both hands flat against William's chest, over the same heartbeat he'd once felt racing beneath thick white fur. "For what it's worth, I never needed any of this. I loved you exactly as you were, thorn and all." "I know," William said quietly, covering Leo's hands with his own. "I did it for myself, in the end. You simply gave me a reason to want to be better than I was." They stood together a while longer in the quiet of the training yard, the last of the daylight fading gold over the castle walls, until Leo finally tugged William toward the door with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Come on. If I'm to be your husband, I insist on seeing the kitchens properly, and I fully intend to have words with whoever has been rationing your cinnamon supply." William, laughing in a way the palace staff would later swear they had never once heard from their king before that week, allowed himself to be led. News of the engagement reached Hallstatt faster than any rumor before it, and if the villagers were initially stunned to learn their missing dog fiasco had, in fact, been the Alpha King all along, their shock lasted approximately as long as it took Frau Lindner to begin planning what pastries would be served at the wedding. The proposal itself happened, fittingly, in Eckern Valley, on an afternoon when the first hints of autumn had begun creeping through the meadow, the wildflowers gone slightly brittle at the edges, the air carrying a new, cooler sharpness beneath the lingering warmth of late summer sun, the old oak's leaves just beginning to curl toward gold. A blue ribbon still hung from its low branch, faded but intact, tied there weeks before by 2 hands that had not yet known where this particular thread would eventually lead. William arrived that afternoon, not as a wolf but as himself, dressed simply, without crown or ceremony, and found Leo exactly where he always found him, cross-legged in the grass, basket at his side, humming to himself as though the last few weeks hadn't upended both their lives entirely. He'd rehearsed the moment more times than he cared to admit, pacing his chambers late into the night, discarding one speech after another as either too formal or not honest enough, until Charles had finally taken pity on him and suggested, with the weary patience of a man who had watched this entire courtship unfold from its very first cinnamon roll, that perhaps William ought to simply say what he meant and trust that it would be enough. William had found the advice both maddening and, upon reflection, entirely correct. "You know," Leo said without looking up, "I keep thinking I should be angrier about the whole Secret King thing. But mostly I just keep remembering how ridiculous you looked, sitting perfectly still while I brushed knots out of your tail." "I was preserving royal dignity," William said solemnly, settling onto the grass beside him. "You were failing spectacularly at preserving royal dignity." "I was failing spectacularly," William agreed, because a very cheerful, very stubborn Omega had decided I was secretly a giant sweetheart, and it turned out he was entirely correct. Leo laughed, bright and unguarded, and it was in the middle of that laugh, mid-breath, cheeks still pink with delight, that William reached into his coat and produced a simple silver ring, its band engraved with a small, unmistakable wolf's paw print. "Leo Hartley," he said, and though his voice shook slightly, his eyes did not waver, "you found me lost in a forest and made me feel, for the first time in my life, like being seen was not a burden but a gift. I have been king of Corinthia for 11 years, and Chubby for considerably less, and I can say with complete certainty which title I've enjoyed more. Will you marry me?" Leo's answer arrived somewhere between a laughing sob and the word yes, and it took the better part of a minute, and the enthusiastic, well-timed swoop of a delighted raven, before either of them managed to speak in complete sentences again. The wedding took place at Hohenwerfen Castle on a bright September morning, the mountains beyond its walls already touched with the first gold of autumn, the lake below glittering like scattered coin. It was, by unanimous village agreement, the least stuffy royal ceremony anyone could remember. Half of Hallstatt in attendance, Frau Lindner personally overseeing a banquet table so heavy with pastries that one very specific, quietly insistent request had overruled every formal court recipe in favor of an enormous tower of cinnamon rolls. Leo stood before a tall mirror that morning, while several attendants fussed over the final touches of his simple white tunic, a single daisy tucked behind one ear. He kept glancing toward the window rather than his own reflection, and one young attendant finally laughed and asked if he was nervous. "Not really," Leo admitted. "I'm mostly wondering whether Chubby remembered to eat breakfast." The room dissolved into helpless laughter. Across the castle, Charles adjusted William's formal collar for what felt like the 10th time that morning. "Please remember," he said, with exaggerated gravity, "that today you are the Alpha King." "I am aware," William said. "Good, because I suspect someone is about to call you Chubby in front of every noble family in the duchy." "He probably will," William said, entirely unbothered, and Charles threw both hands into the air in theatrical surrender. When Leo appeared beneath the arch of white roses in the great hall, every ounce of William's carefully composed dignity lasted exactly as long as it took their eyes to meet. Charles leaned toward the nearest council elder and murmured, not quite quietly enough, "There goes the serious king we used to know." When it came time for vows, William spoke first, his voice steady despite the color rising in his cheeks. "You found me lost and gave me kindness before you ever knew my name. You taught me that being seen wasn't something to fear. I have ruled this duchy for 11 years, and you have made every single day since we met feel more like home than any of them." Leo looked at him with the same warmth he'd once shown a wolf beneath an oak tree and said, "Whether you're a king or a giant white wolf waiting for cinnamon biscuits, you'll always be my favorite Chubby." A line that sent a wave of affectionate laughter rippling through the entire hall, Lord Hessler included. As they exchanged rings, the old raven swept in through an open window and dropped the original blue ribbon, retrieved, somehow, from wherever ravens keep their treasures, directly into William's waiting hands. He tied it gently around Leo's bouquet before offering it back. "Some things," he murmured, "deserve to stay with us forever." The feast that followed lasted well into the evening, spilling out from the great hall into the torchlit courtyard, where villagers and nobles found themselves dancing the same reels shoulder to shoulder for what was likely the first time in the duchy's history. Edmund Faust, 3 cups of mulled wine deep, loudly proposed a toast to the wolf who stole my chances before I ever had any, which earned him a good-natured shove from Leo and a rare, genuine laugh from William. Frau Lindner wept openly over her cinnamon rolls, informing anyone within earshot that she had personally predicted this outcome from the very first morning Leo dragged a wolf into the village square. A claim nobody quite believed, though nobody argued with her either, not on a night like this one. Winter came softly to Hohenwerfen that first year, dusting the courtyard in white and turning Lake Hallstatt to a sheet of pale, still glass. Inside the castle, in a set of rooms that had once belonged to a king who ate his meals alone and slept badly, 2 people now argued cheerfully over breakfast about whether cinnamon belonged in porridge. It belongs everywhere, Leo said, spooning a generous amount into William's bowl before he could object. I've built an entire personality around this opinion. You don't get to challenge it now. I wasn't challenging it, William said, entirely unconvincingly, and ate the porridge anyway. Spring came next, and with it the reopening of Eckern Valley's wildflower trails, and Leo spent an entire golden afternoon teaching William the names of every flower he could remember from childhood, most of which William promptly forgot and pretended, with great seriousness, still to know. Summer brought the midsummer fair once more, and this time William attended it properly, as himself, standing beside his husband at the honey cake stall, while Frau Lindner loudly informed anyone within earshot that she had, in fact, always suspected there was something special about that wolf. Married life had not, to the great disappointment of several gossiping ladies-in-waiting, made either of them the slightest bit more dignified. Leo still marched into council meetings uninvited to deliver tea and unsolicited opinions on tax policy. William still disappeared, without fail, every single evening to the training yard, a habit Leo had long since stopped teasing him about, mostly because he had discovered, quite by accident one evening, that watching his husband finish a set of push-ups, shirtless in the torchlight, did significantly more to his composure than any amount of cinnamon ever had. You know you don't have to keep doing that, Leo told him one night, watching from the doorway with his arms crossed and a smile he wasn't bothering to hide. I believe I mentioned several months ago now that I found you extremely handsome exactly as you were. William, mid-sit-up, paused just long enough to look over at him. I know. Then why? Because you also called me Chubby with such enormous affection that I have never once managed to forget it, William said, rising to his feet and crossing the yard toward him, unhurried, silver eyes warm in the low light. And because some part of me still wants, every single day, to be worth however you happen to look at me. Leo's teasing smile softened into something quieter. You've always been worth it, you impossible man. Fluffy, fit, or otherwise. Autumn brought the harvest festival, and with it, a small private tradition neither of them had planned but both had come to treasure. Each year, on the anniversary of the day, a very confused young Omega had dragged a wolf through the middle of Hallstatt. Frau Lindner baked an enormous tower of cinnamon rolls and delivered it personally to the castle gates, refusing payment every single time. Call it a wedding gift that never stops giving, she told the bewildered kitchen staff the first year, and refused to explain further. Edmund Faust, to everyone's mild surprise, had become a frequent visitor to the castle kitchens, having struck up an unlikely friendship with the head huntsman, and more improbably, with William himself, the 2 of them now prone to good-natured arguments over the best method for tracking elk through fresh snow. I still say you cheated. Edmund grumbled at supper one evening, nursing a bruised pride from that afternoon's hunting wager. No man tracks that quietly without 4 legs and a very unfair advantage. William merely smiled into his cup and said nothing, while Leo, seated beside him, laughed so hard he nearly upset the gravy. Their favorite ritual, the one the whole castle staff had long since given up commenting on, took place every Sunday without fail, a walk down the mountain road to Eckern Valley, where the old oak tree still stood, faded blue ribbon fluttering from its lowest branch, and where, much to the eternal scandal of the royal guard assigned to trail discreetly behind them, the Alpha King of Carinthia would occasionally, when he was certain no one important was watching, shift into a great white wolf simply so his husband could sit beside him in the grass and scratch behind his left ear, exactly where he liked it most. The valley never seemed to change, no matter the season, the same stream chattering over the same smooth stones, the same slant of afternoon light turning the grass to something like spun gold, the same quiet hush that had, on one foggy morning a lifetime ago, first convinced a lonely Omega he'd found somebody's lost dog. Sometimes, when the light was just right and the wind carried the scent of pine down from the higher slopes, Leo would close his eyes and swear he could still hear the exact moment the whole village had gone up in chaos over one very large, very misidentified animal. He never quite decided whether to be embarrassed by it or grateful for it, and eventually stopped trying to choose, settling instead on something closer to fond. The same fondness, he supposed, that had carried them from a foggy forest path all the way to this quiet, golden life neither of them had ever quite dared to hope for. "There's my brave boy," Leo told him one such afternoon, laughing as an unmistakable tail thump gave away every ounce of dignity William had ever pretended to possess. 11 years ruling a kingdom, and I'm still the only one who's worked out you're secretly the softest thing in it. The raven, watching from its usual branch, gave one satisfied caw, accepted a cinnamon biscuit from Leo's outstretched palm, and settled in to watch the sunset paint the valley gold, content, as it had been from the very first foggy morning, that the wrong dog had turned out, in the end, to be exactly the right one. If this story tugged at something in you, drop a comment and tell us which moment made you smile the most. We read every single one. Hit like and subscribe so we know to keep bringing you more stories like Leo and William's. Thank you for spending this time with us, truly.